For quite a while now, I've wanted to make a video on the 1993 game Myst, and I really tried to do it in a few ways. Initially, I wanted to do an iceberg chart on the subject, but I put it on the back burner for a while until I eventually got beat to the punch. I thought I could spend some time just exploring the spaces of this game, as many locations in not just the 1993 game, but throughout the entire Myst saga are extremely uncanny, and by the accepted definition used by the internet, liminal. For a game that's just about puzzles and exploring a far-off mystical land, Myst is extremely unnerving. The musical scores and harsh sound effects can surprise you, as you travel completely alone through environments that don't seem to make much sense logistically, using technology that is certainly alien. I thought really hard about what it was that drew me to Myst. Was it the gameplay? Honestly, no. I remember the first time I played through Myst a long time ago, and I was constantly looking up answers because the puzzles can get sorta hard and don't necessarily seem logical or fair at times. There are a lot of people that would agree with me in saying that Myst is an incredible game, but not necessarily a fun one. The gameplay could certainly use some work. Then I speculated that it might be the story of the game that I enjoyed. The story of Myst itself doesn't take much importance at all during your playthrough, and the lore of the series doesn't really kick in till much later. With no substantial explanation, you fall into the Myst Island and begin to unravel a mystery between three characters as you solve the puzzles, but the story about this mystery isn't too incredible, and it takes a backseat compared to the main gameplay, which is already arguably lackluster. Now, the lore of this series is developed extensively in books and later games, but even that isn't too incredible compared to other games and their lore. Myst lore is fascinating in some ways, but it just didn't really captivate me. So, with gameplay that has aged like milk, and a lackluster murder mystery story that grips my attention the same way beige paint does, what do I even like about Myst? What drew me to it? I had to reflect on this question for a long time. How on earth did this game, that I don't even really enjoy playing now that I've finished it, sell millions of copies, get ported onto more than a dozen platforms, spawn a huge franchise, and create an entire genre of Myst clones? I'm not the only person to think this. Myst has been called little more than an interactive slideshow, and yet it almost spawned a theme park and it spawned a TV show that's currently in the works. And then it hit me. I thought back to my favorite playthrough of Myst, which was probably my second or third one, and what I remember doing is looking up all the answers to the puzzles that let you travel to a new age, meaning I only did the puzzles that gave me more places to go. And then I went back to the start and just explored. For some reason, Myst was incredibly fun to look at and walk around. When Myst came out, it was praised for being incredibly immersive, which I would say nowadays isn't really that true. The strength of Myst's art doesn't come from the graphics, it comes from the eerie locations. Strange places that make no sense to build, that seem liminal and familiar, yet simultaneously completely alien. Playing Myst, and games like it, feels like a strange dream. Everything's a tad fuzzy, and even if you encounter other people, you can just kind of see that they aren't close to real. Other characters in games like these are husks. You are fully alone, walking in worlds that, while peaceful, aren't quite right. It's kind of like giving an AI pictures of rooms and setting it loose. The AI can construct a marble floor and windows based on pictures it's seen, but it doesn't understand what a human would use the room for. So regardless of how architecturally polished these locations are, they just aren't right. They're not practical in any way. They're not human. I don't think I'm the first to point out how Myst propelled the gaming scene, and also spawned dozens of similar games. But I don't think people appreciate what makes all of these games similar to Myst, because let me tell you, it has nothing to do with puzzles or the fact that it's a point-and-click game. I'd like to label this art form Mystwave. Drawing upon the namesake of art styles like Vaporwave, I think that while Myst wasn't the first to do every little thing that Mystwave entails, it was certainly the most important pioneer. I've searched for and played all kinds of games that exemplify this art style, and I've come to realize based on how many examples there are and how well those examples fit my definition, that Mystwave really is its own art style that hasn't been given credit for all that it does. Let me explain what Mystwave is, what made it so unique as an art style in gaming, and how it influenced the gaming world. Sit tight and enjoy the video. Mystwave art is very strange, to say the least. Games from this time designed in this way had many hurdles to overcome when it came to graphics, so tons of shortcuts here and there had to be made. From a physical standpoint, as in how the games look, not really what they are. Mystwave games are characterized by a strange sense of fuzziness that seems to pervade the entire screen, often jarringly interrupted by animations that seem out of place, or photorealistic cutscenes, or, my personal favorite, actors that have been seemingly green screened right into the foreground. The weird graphics produce a strange effect, amplifying the fact that Mystwave games are just, well, weird. Mystwave games feel dreamlike, and the fuzzy graphics and strange interruptions unintentionally support this feeling. But perhaps the most fun part of Mystwave to discuss is the architecture. Most of these games take place indoors, or at least the better part of the gameplay takes place indoors. I mentioned earlier how weird this architecture is. These games were designed from the obvious standpoint of puzzles first and settings second, and it's not subtle at all. Rooms are often too big or clearly too small for their purpose, a purpose which isn't clear. Obviously, in games and all sorts of media, it's sort of a trope that there's a puzzle before a grand entrance, but in Mystwave games, it's just over the top, and it can bring you to a state of utter confusion. True to the story of Myst, where you occasionally visit places created by the ancient civilization known as the Dunny, Mystwave buildings are very alien. Even if the spaces seem to fit your character anatomically, which they sometimes don't, you can just feel that they weren't created for you. You walk around in these rooms knowing that you aren't supposed to be here. Myst isn't the only game to weave that feeling into its story, and this is a point we'll expand upon in another section of this video. But one way or another, these areas feel surreal, strange, and quite honestly, uncomfortable. Hardware limitations shape games, often for the better. You might know some examples of games like Silent Hill, where a graphical constraint turned into a phenomenal mechanic. In the case of that game, obviously, it was the fog, which saved memory by covering parts of the environment, but ended up looking a lot creepier. I don't really know much about the technical side of games, and any explanation about graphics that I could give you would be paraphrased from Wikipedia and just full of errors, so I'll just talk about how these graphics look from the perspective of someone who only plays games and doesn't make them. Mystwave graphics are weird, just plain weird. These point-and-click or occasionally maneuverable games are different from previous point-and-click games, the primary innovation being animated transitions. These are cool and they make it feel more like a real environment, and it's certainly better than just fading into the next scene, but they're extremely choppy. In games like this, I find it common to stare at a puzzle for upwards of a minute before figuring out what to do, or at least before I start playing with it and trying to guess a solution, and seeing the scene change abruptly is just jarring. And anytime you try to watch a cutscene, the resolution is absolutely tiny. It's just funny. Regardless of why these graphics look the way they do, Mystwave games all look the same. I mean, if you took out the heads-up display in some of these games, I bet you couldn't guess what environment was from what game, or what series, if you hadn't played through them already. This section is kinda light because there's not much valuable commentary I can provide about Mystwave graphics, but they're a defining part of the art that needs to be mentioned. Perhaps the most fascinating and universal characteristic of Mystwave games is the presence of a horrifying story, a sense of detachment, and difficult themes. You could easily play through these games, not knowing that there's a terrifying storyline just beneath your feet. Some of these games, like Lighthouse: The Dark Being, are much more obvious about the darker themes, though some, good old Myst included, are very subtle. In Myst, a game which is totally just about solving puzzles, you're presented with themes of imprisonment, isolation, and madness. The entire plot revolves around finding pages to add to books which house prisons for two sons, both of whom try and convince you to free them and condemn the other. Their father, too, is trapped in his own world, and you may realize at some point that if these three people, one of whom made all of these worlds, can't leave, then what about you? In fact, there are 4 endings to this game, and only one of them is good. You can free either brother, and regardless of who you pick, they'll imprison you for your choice. You can return to the father, and depending on whether or not you brought him a page he needed, you'll either be trapped with him for eternity or escape. If you do escape, you return to Myst, which makes sense for replayability, but you never actually go home. Another game that's a shining example of Mystwave is Obsidian. It's just another puzzle game, sure, but one where characters are coupling with a world built by an artificial intelligence they created and accidentally let get out of hand, who wishes to destroy all of humanity, believing them to be dangerous to the betterment of the Earth. Ceres, as she is called, is made of a hive mind of nanobots who, despite having the full ability and conviction to destroy humanity, ultimately seek approval from what they believe to be their parents. This game asks difficult questions about the nature of artificial intelligence, brings up themes of Jungian psychology, and yet as terrifying as these things may be, the player is never forced to reconcile with these issues. They can just keep solving puzzles. And how could I discuss these themes without referencing Drowned God, a game which is essentially a vessel for a conspiracy theory fanfiction created by Harry Horse, which, by the way, it's an absolutely insane story and I highly recommend watching this video for more info on that game. But essentially, this game references all kinds of conspiracy theories and strings them together to form a surreal story of deceit throughout human history, ultimately culminating in one of 3 endings, 2 of which describe horrible apocalyptic scenarios ushered in by Men in Black, and a 3rd where aliens ominously arrive without much explanation. I'm really glad I made this video, but I honestly struggled to write a conclusion here. The purpose of this video, which I guess I discovered halfway through making it, is just to identify an art phase that came and passed 20 years ago. Sure, people know about Myst and these so-called Myst clones, a term I've come to despise throughout making this video, and it's just as annoying to me as other phrases like Souls-like or Doom clone, which lump entire games into a box and by their association to another, albeit maybe better game, but that doesn't mean they can't stand for themselves. I can't honestly even recommend whether or not you should play Mystwave games. I can. I think they're incredible experiences, and just walking through these spaces and environments is like going to an art gallery. But is that worth gameplay that's really outdated? Maybe, maybe not. I personally enjoy walking through these environments, but I don't always appreciate the work involved in getting there. Some Mystwave games were really just made to chase Myst, without being subtle at all. They might have had great art, but made no effort to playtest the game. There are actually some Mystwave games where you can get stuck in soft locks, because the gameplay wasn't fleshed out well enough. One thing about Mystwave games that I wanted to mention is how much of an effect it had on the gaming industry without people crediting the art form. There are games that have obvious Mystwave influence, The Witness being a great example and likely the most popular one. In this game, you're a playtester for a game in development, though some game features like NPCs aren't being tested. The only thing you're concerned with is puzzles. So you're sucked into a world with little to no explanation, you're alone, you solve puzzles, and there's evidence of hidden lore as well as deeper meanings to the game. Sound familiar? That comparison is a little bit on the nose though. What else did these games do? Well, there are some general big picture effects that Mystwave games had on gaming. These games didn't include combat, dying, health, respawns, they were just peaceful. Games like that did exist, but they weren't nearly as popular before 1993. Arcade games, by design, needed to get you killed to make money. Timers counting down, enemies, action, and speed were the norm, and Mystwave games helped cool that down. But there's more to it than just that. When it came to art style, early games were typically fantasy, science fiction, or realistic. There wasn't a ton of overlap. Mystwave games made surrealism a thing in gaming. They paved the way for games to be weird, artistic, and strange. Many of these games took place in worlds that were a blend of science fiction and fantasy, creating worlds that were obviously futuristic but had rocket punk, steampunk, and fantasy features. This type of setting has appeared all over gaming, from games like Final Fantasy to Infinity Blade to Shadow of the Colossus. Literally anywhere you look, you can see some sort of stylistic influence. Mystwave games, in their picture-based style, were also sort of pioneers of game environments. Early 90s games were often top-down or 2D or very low-detailed 3D environments like Doom. Mystwave games were sort of a window into the future, giving gamers a taste of what more realistic graphics would look like 10 years from then. Although you couldn't move freely in these worlds, you had a preview of what gaming environments would eventually look like, and it's ignorant to assume that these games had no effect on the development of 3D worlds. And finally, what about lore? I would be remiss if I didn't explain how big of an effect Mystwave had on game lore. Before Myst, if games had a story, they told you up front or maybe on the back of the box. Mystwave games drop you into a world with no explanation, forcing you to really dig deep to figure out what's going on, while also leaving the commonly used backdoor option of just playing through the game without critically analyzing the world. And in some Mystwave games, there's no answer. You'll never be able to understand what's going on or what the implications of what you've experienced are. This model is insanely common in gaming now. Minecraft, for example, literally does this. The days of searching for lore within games were perhaps not started by, but certainly propelled by Mystwave. Now, theorizing and gaming lore have become their own sector of internet discussion, and this wouldn't have happened without Mystwave. I see why Mystwave died, and why it isn't remembered too well. I've tried to distance myself from the term Myst clones, but it's understandable why people assumed every one of these games was just copying Myst rather than this being a style. The Mystwave market became super saturated very quickly, and people got burnt out. Not only that, but many of these games just naturally fell into obscurity. I mean, it's been well over 20 years since most of these games came out. I don't blame the community for not recognizing Mystwave before this moment, and I certainly don't blame them for forgetting it. Mystwave games, paradoxically, made so many innovations so early that they took a while to sink in. Like I said, Mystwave games were a time machine into the future. Their graphics, their lore, these things didn't become commonplace until years later, so it's understandable that people haven't made the connection between Mystwave games and games that came years later. The biggest tragedy of Mystwave was that it was so forward-thinking that it never got any credit. Without a doubt, I've learned a few lessons while making this video. First off, Mystwave games did a lot more for gaming than we appreciate. And more generally, you can't write off a genre of games for being too similar to another. Doom clones aren't Doom clones, they're first-person shooters that all tell different stories and showcase different IPs. Not every game has to be a game changer. You wouldn't criticize an artist for using paint just because someone else before them used paint. Features in games are tools, and those who follow pioneers are allowed to use those tools without criticism, so long as they put the bare minimum into making their game a bit different, which most Mystwave games did. With that said, maybe go try out some of these games, or at the very least, watch footage of them. Don't just play Myst, but play Abduction, Rem, Lighthouse the Dark Being, Quern, L-Zone, Haven Moon, Aura, Schism, Beyond Time, Eyes of Ara, Crystal Key, Rhea, Riddle of the Sphinx, Alita, Matanui Online game, which is literally Myst meets Bionicles. Have some fun with them, explore some environments, get creeped out and try to sink into the lore of a 25-year-old game. I really hope you guys enjoyed this commentary. Thank you all, and good night.